On the night of the gala, my grandson looked at me, laughed at my suit, and whispered loud enough for his friends to hear, "He looks like he borrowed it from a thrift store." The words struck harder than any slap. I had thought the dark jacket, pressed with care, carried the weight of my dignity. I had chosen it not for style, but for memory, stitched decades ago by a tailor who shook my hand and said, "Wear this to moments that matter." But to the boy I once carried on my shoulders, it was nothing but a joke, a costume unfit for the stage of the present. I felt the sting immediately, though I tried to hide it. His friends laughed with him, their young eyes sharp with the cruelty of confidence. The sound of their mocking carried further than the music, cutting through the hum of the hall. For a moment I touched the sleeve of my suit as if to check whether it had betrayed me, whether it had lost its shape or its soul. Yet I knew the truth. The betrayal was not in the fabric, but in the blood that laughed at it. I lowered myself into a seat near the back, pretending not to hear, pretending to belong. The chandeliers shimmered above me, lighting polished shoes and silk gowns, but not me. I sat there as though the very air had pushed me aside. My grandson glanced at me once more, the curl of his lip carrying both pride and shame. The pride of youth, the shame of being tied to someone he now considered outdated. He had never seen the battles fought in this suit, the contract signed, the friendship sealed, the tears of his grandmother dried in the crook of this very sleeve. To him, it was just an old man's costume. As I sat, the world seemed to shrink. My family passed by, their eyes sliding over me, treating me like furniture rather than flesh. I smiled weakly, but inside I felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid words pressing against my chest. Betrayal doesn't always come as disowning. Sometimes it comes disguised as laughter at what you hold sacred. And in that moment I realized that the bond of generations can unravel not with anger, but with a smirk. Yet I did not leave. I adjusted my suit again, smoothing the wrinkles with a hand that trembled, not from age, but from restraint. Let them laugh. Let them think I was invisible. Dignity does not vanish because youth cannot see it. The night was long, and truth has its own timing. I would wait. I would endure. And in the silence between their whispers, I swore to myself that before this evening ended, my suit would speak louder than their laughter. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and reach more people with these powerful stories. And now, let's continue. His grandson leaned closer to his friends, his voice low, but sharp enough to pierce through the air, words that did not need volume to wound. They all leaned in, glancing sideways at me, and then the ripple of laughter followed, light to them, but heavy as iron on my shoulders. It was not just a laugh at a suit, it was a laugh at a life. Every crease, every fold of the jacket I had chosen with pride became, in their eyes, proof of my smallness. I could feel their amusement settling on me like ash, smothering the quiet dignity I had hoped to carry into that room. I sat motionless, but inside everything trembled. Betrayal rarely arrives as a storm. Sometimes it slips in disguised as the smallest sound, the smallest gesture, a whisper meant for mockery, not meant to be answered. That whisper carved its way deeper than any argument could, because it was not spoken in anger, but in dismissal. To be dismissed, to be rendered laughable in the very eyes that once looked up to you in childhood wonder. That is a wound sharper than rage. The music swelled, the chandeliers sparkled, but the brightness of the hall only made my place in it darker. My grandson's laughter lingered like an echo, replaying against my chest until it became unbearable silence. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake working, the years I had denied myself comfort so that my children, and later their children, would not have to. All of that sacrifice now reduced to a whisper that erased me in seconds. To them, I was not the man who built, who gave, who endured. I was only a wrinkle, a suit that no longer matched their world. Yet I forced myself to breathe evenly, to hold my head as though nothing had pierced me. Because I knew dignity that crumbles at laughter was never real dignity. I pressed my hand against the armrest, steadying myself, and in the silence of my own heart I made a vow. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could reduce me to nothing in their eyes, but truth does not bow to mockery. Before this night ended, the very fabric they ridiculed would tell a story that none of them could laugh away. I walked past the shining tables and the glitter of gowns, past the polished shoes that tapped impatiently against marble, and I chose a chair in the shadows. It was not assigned to me. It was simply where no one else wanted to sit. The back of the hall swallowed me like an afterthought, and I lowered myself there, the weight of years pressing more heavily than the suit upon my shoulders. Around me the air was thick with perfume and laughter, voices rising to celebrate themselves, their own importance, their own radiance. I was part of the gathering, yes, but not a part of them. I sat as if behind glass, close enough to see, too far to touch. The chandeliers threw rivers of light across the hall, but none of it seemed to reach me. Instead, the shadow wrapped around my chair like a cloak, and I realized this was where they believed I belonged, in the margins, unseen, silent, forgotten. My grandson had returned to his circle of friends, his laughter blending with theirs, as if I were already erased from the evening. He would not look back at me, because shadows do not call for attention. He wanted me to stay there, where his modern pride would not be burdened by the image of the man in the outdated suit. I sat still, my hands folded together, my eyes moving from one glittering figure to the next. For a moment, I felt the hollowness of my seat echo inside me. Years of sacrifice, of sweat poured into foundations, of nights spent working under flickering lamps. All of it seemed to dissolve in that shadowed chair. Betrayal does not always roar. It whispers. It passes by without meeting your eyes. It places you in the corner until you begin to wonder if you were ever meant to sit in the light. But as I watched them, something inside me refused to bend. My chair might have been in the shadows, but I was not shadows. I was flesh, blood, memory, labor, sacrifice. They did not see me now, but that did not make me less. I had endured too much to vanish in silence. The hall might have placed me behind, but destiny has a way of rearranging seats, and one day, even tonight, the man in the corner would be the name they all remembered. I forced a smile, though it trembled on my lips like glass about to shatter. It was the same smile I had worn countless times before, at birthdays when no one remembered who paid for the candles, at dinners when my presence was tolerated but never sought, at moments when I chose silence so others could keep their pride. Behind that smile lived years of sacrifice, nights spent over work that broke my back, days when I denied myself so my children and grandchildren could live in comfort, choices that had carved away my youth so theirs could flourish. Every wrinkle on my face was stitched with those choices, yet none of that weight showed to the eyes that mocked me now. Under the chandeliers, the light was too bright, too cruel. It revealed every crease in my jacket, every shadow on my face, every sign that time had written its name on me. My smile under that light felt smaller, weaker, like a mask borrowed for the evening. Around me, faces gleamed with youth and pride, polished by wealth and vanity. Their laughter rang louder than the music, while mine faded before it could even be born. I sat there, smiling, but it was a fragile thing, so thin it could be swept away by the next careless word or thoughtless glance. And yet I held it, because letting it slip would mean admitting how deeply the wound cut. I would not give them that satisfaction. My smile was not joy, not celebration. It was endurance. It was my way of telling the world that even if they buried me in shadows, I would not crumble. Still, the loneliness behind it weighed on me heavily. To smile and remain unseen is to carry a cross no one else acknowledges, a burden without witnesses. That night my smile was almost invisible, but it was real. It was all I had to hold against the tide of indifference that threatened to erase me. They walked past me as if I were made of air, my own blood. The people who carried my name brushed by without so much as a glance. I could hear their voices, cheerful, eager, sharp with ambition, yet none of them paused to greet me, none reached out a hand, none offered even the courtesy of acknowledgement. My presence was tolerated, yes, but never cherished. I was a relic, an obligation, something to be endured in silence rather than embraced with warmth. Each time they passed without stopping, the distance between us grew wider than oceans. The music played on, elegant and triumphant, but in my mind it was drowned by something harsher, my grandson's laughter. It replayed again and again, not as a sound now, but as a judgment, an accusation, a cruel verdict on who I had become in their eyes. That mocking laugh weighed heavier than the chandeliers hanging above us, heavier than the marble pillars that guarded the hall. It pressed down on my chest until even breathing felt like betrayal of my own dignity. I remembered when his laughter was different, when it rang out as a child's joy on my shoulders, when he would clutch my hand and beg me to tell another story, when I would buy him ice cream on afternoons that stretched endlessly. That laughter had once been my reward, my reason to keep moving, my proof that sacrifice was worth it. Now it had transformed into a blade, wielded not by strangers, but by the very child I had loved beyond reason. To be wounded by family is to bleed in a place where no one can see, yet everyone can touch. I sat there in my shadowed chair, my fragile smile fading, and realized that betrayal did not always come with words like, "You are not family." Sometimes it came with silence, with eyes that did not meet yours, with footsteps that moved past as if you were invisible. Indifference is colder than hate. Hate at least acknowledges you. Indifference erases you while you still breathe. And that night, under the glitter of chandeliers, I felt myself being erased, piece by piece. But inside, beneath the crushing weight of their dismissal, a stubborn ember burned. They could laugh, they could ignore, they could pretend I was nothing. But the truth has a way of surviving, even in silence. I clung to that ember, hidden beneath layers of pain, because the night was not over, and neither was I. The music softened, and the host walked toward the microphone, his polished shoes clicking like a metronome across the marble floor. The hall shifted into silence, a silence heavy with expectation. Programs rustled in eager hands, eyes lifted, faces glowed with anticipation of names that mattered, titles that glittered, fortunes that dazzled. The speaker's voice rose smooth and confident, praising donors, partners, benefactors. Each name carried weight, carved into the pages of the booklet that everyone held like scripture. Applause broke after each announcement, thunderous, generous, as though admiration itself could be measured in clapping hands. I sat still in my shadowed seat, invisible, my name nowhere on their lips, my sacrifices absent from the pages they adored. The applause roared for strangers who had written checks, for companies whose fortunes were built on numbers rather than sweat, for people who had touched this place only with gold, never with flesh or endurance. Faces around me lit up, heads turned toward those being praised, but no one turned to me. No one thought to look. In their eyes, I was only a forgotten figure in a worn suit, a man who had come out of duty, not relevance. Each clap felt like a hammer against my chest, not because I envied their recognition, but because the silence toward me was louder than any ovation. It was as if the years I had poured into work, the unseen sacrifices I had buried in silence, had been erased by omission. Betrayal comes in many shapes, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in indifference, and sometimes in the simple cruelty of being passed over, as if your very existence were a misprint. I lowered my gaze for a moment, staring at the floor that had carried my weary steps so many times in life. My hands tightened against each other, my jaw clenched. I could feel the years of labor pressing against my memory, contracts signed in long nights, promises kept when it cost me everything, the quiet satisfaction of building not for myself, but for the family that now refused to see me. The chandeliers poured light across the honored guests, while I sat untouched, like a shadow clinging stubbornly to the wall. And yet, beneath the indifference of the room, I felt a strange calm. I did not rise, did not protest, did not demand what was mine. I knew something they did not know, that truth cannot stay hidden forever. They could announce every name in their glossy booklet. They could shower applause on strangers, but the night was long, and sooner or later they would hear a name they had forgotten, a name they had dismissed, a name no one expected to rise from the shadows. His voice cut through the hall sharper than the applause had ever sounded. My grandson leaned in toward his friends again, his words meant to be hidden but carried straight to me. He doesn't belong here. It was not shouted, it was not cruel in volume, but in its certainty, and that certainty landed like a blade. Around him others did not laugh this time, they only nodded, the quiet assent of people who believed they had seen enough. To them I was not a guest, I was not family, I was simply a shadow in an outdated suit, taking up a chair that might have been better left empty. The silence that followed was worse than mockery. It wrapped around me like chains, binding me tighter than anger ever could. I felt their agreement seep into the air, thick and suffocating, a verdict pronounced without trial. Betrayal does not always need words. Sometimes it lives in glances, in the way shoulders turn away, in the weight of silence that confirms you are no longer worthy. I sat still, my hands folded, my heart pounding not with rage but with a sorrow too heavy to hold. The suit I wore, once a symbol of dignity, now felt like a prison, every wrinkle branded as evidence of my unworthiness. I thought of the nights I had worked with no witness, the mornings I had left before sunrise so that my children would never know hunger, the years of discipline, the choices that had stolen comfort from me so they could have more. All of it seemed to collapse in that single whisper. To be told you don't belong by strangers is pain enough, but to hear it from your own blood, from the very mouth that once called you Grandpa with joy, is to feel the ground beneath you crumble. The hall glowed with laughter and light, but around me the world dimmed. My grandson's words echoed louder than any speech from the stage, louder than any applause. They replayed in my mind until they became truth, or at least the truth they all believed, and as the silence thickened, I understood that in their eyes, I was already erased. But deep inside, beneath the wounds of betrayal, a steady fire refused to die. They had decided I did not belong, but belonging is not theirs to give or take. The suit they mocked was not just fabric. It carried history, sweat, sacrifice, and a legacy they had yet to discover. They did not know it yet, but before this night was over, the silence they cast over me would break. And when it did, the sound of truth would be louder than all their whispers combined. The microphone crackled, a sharp burst of static that cut through the polished rhythm of the evening. The host, who had been gliding effortlessly from one name to another, stopped mid-sentence. The shift was immediate. His posture straightened, his voice lowered, and suddenly the air thickened as though something sacred was about to be spoken. The hall, restless only moments ago with chatter and laughter, leaned forward all at once, hundreds of eyes drawn not to each other, but to the stage. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. The tone had changed. Gone was the rehearsed cheer of formal gratitude. the polished cadence of acknowledging benefactors and sponsors, as though reading from a checklist. In its place came reverence, a weight that made every word that followed feel heavier, older, more important. Even those who had been whispering and mocking just moments before fell silent, their curiosity pulling them into the moment. It was the kind of pause that commands obedience without a single demand, the kind of stillness that makes even the proudest necks bow slightly. I sat in my corner, unnoticed, the laughter of my grandson still burning faintly in my ears. Yet something in the host's voice pricked at me, stirred me, though I could not yet understand why. The way he spoke now was not casual, it was not routine. It was as though he were summoning someone greater than the event itself, someone whose presence carried history, weight, and sacrifice. My heart slowed, then quickened, as if it had recognized something before my mind could grasp it. I saw people in the front rows glance at their programs, flipping the glossy pages for the name that matched the shift in tone. The chandeliers shimmered more softly now, as if even their light had dimmed to make space for what was about to unfold. The hush of expectation stretched across the hall, binding us all together in the same silence. For the first time that night, no one dared to whisper, not even my grandson. And in that pause, so fragile and so powerful, I felt it. The balance of the evening tipping. The unseen thread of justice tightening. Something was coming. Something none of them expected. Something that would turn shadows into light. The host's next words would not just announce a name. They would summon a truth that had waited in silence for far too long. The host's voice steadied, and then it came, the sound of my name, carried not as an afterthought, not tucked into a list of acknowledgments, but spoken with weight, with reverence, with the solemnity of truth. It rang across the hall like a bell, shaking loose the silence that had pressed down on me all night. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that my weary heart had conjured the sound to soothe its wounds. But no, the host repeated it, louder this time, with the full declaration that the main benefactor, the sponsor whose generosity had made the entire event possible, was none other than me. The words struck the air like a storm breaking open the sky. My name. The same name my grandson had mocked. The same name my family had passed over with indifference, now stood at the very center of the evening. The chandeliers glowed brighter as though they too recognized it. Heads turned in every direction, eyes widening, mouths parting in disbelief. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause began, not polite, not routine, but hesitant, rising, uncertain at first, as if the crowd had to teach itself how to reconcile the man in the worn suit with the name that now carried such power. I felt every pair of eyes search for me in the shadows. Their gazes crawled across the rows until they landed on my chair, the seat I had chosen at the edge of invisibility. My grandson's smirk dissolved into something else, confusion, then shame, then a silence so heavy it could have cracked the floor beneath him. He had laughed at me. He had whispered that I did not belong. Now the truth mocked him, louder than any words I could ever speak. My heart beat in my chest, not with pride, but with the raw ache of justice. I had not come here to be recognized. I had not come to be applauded. Yet justice has a way of finding its moment, and mine had come wrapped in the voice of the host, in the stunned silence of the hall, in the reluctant awe of those who had dismissed me. Every sacrifice, every hour of labor, every wrinkle in the suit they ridiculed, had gathered together in this single instant, demanding to be seen. I remained seated for a moment longer, the weight of their stares pressing down like heat. My fingers brushed the sleeve of my jacket, the same jacket they had mocked, and I understood. It had not betrayed me. It had waited, patient and silent, to speak when the time was right. And now, without words, it shouted my legacy louder than any applause could. The applause struck me like thunder rolling through the hall, wave after wave crashing against the marble walls until it felt as though the very building trembled. People rose from their seats, a sea of polished shoes and jeweled hands clapping as if the air itself demanded tribute. Heads turned in unison, eyes wide, searching, landing on me, the man they had overlooked, the shadow in the corner now dragged into light by truth itself. Their faces shifted from confusion to awe, from arrogance to shame, as though a mirror had been lifted before them, and they could not bear what they saw. For me, the sound did not come as sweetness. It did not feel like honor or reward. It burned. Every clap was fire against my skin. Each cheer a reminder of the silence I had endured, the laughter I had swallowed, the betrayal I had carried without answer. This applause was not born of love or loyalty. It was born of revelation, of recognition too late to heal the wounds already carved. They clapped not because they cherished me, but because the truth had forced their hands together. And yet, even as I sat still beneath the weight of their ovation, my eyes found my grandson. His laughter, so cruel only moments before, died in his throat, smothered by the roar of a truth he could no longer deny. His mouth hung open for an instant, then closed tightly, his head bowing under the unbearable weight of shame. He did not meet my gaze. He could not. The boy who had whispered that I did not belong now drowned in the storm of applause that declared I had always belonged more than any of them. I felt tears press against the corners of my eyes, though I would not let them fall. My dignity had already bled enough tonight. I rose slowly, my body heavy with years, my suit glowing beneath the chandeliers not because it was new or fashionable, but because it now bore the light of truth. Each step I took carried the fire of that applause, burning away the years of dismissal, the shadows of indifference, the cruelty of whispers. They saw me now, all of them, and no laughter could ever erase it again. But as I walked forward, I carried no triumph, only the solemn weight of justice. Applause may thunder, but dignity speaks more quietly. And in that burning storm of recognition I understood. This was not their gift to me, it was mine to them. A truth they could no longer escape. I rose slowly, the sound of applause still thundering around me. And for the first time that night, I did not feel the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. My suit, the one they had laughed at, no longer felt like fabric worn thin with age. It felt like armor, like royal cloth stitched not by a tailor but by sacrifice itself. Every wrinkle now seemed carved with purpose, every seam carrying the story of nights endured, battles fought, and dignity preserved when there was nothing else left to hold. As I stepped into the aisle, the noise around me shifted. The applause no longer sounded like a storm outside my body. It became the rhythm of my steps, a drumbeat that carried me forward. Each footfall erased a whisper, each movement burned away a smirk. The distance between the shadows of the back row and the brightness of the stage was not long, yet in those moments it stretched like a lifetime. And with every step I walked through the years of betrayal, through the silence of indifference, through the laughter that had wounded me, and with every step I left those things behind. Eyes followed me now, wide and unblinking. The same mouths that had once curled in mockery were pressed shut, unable to form words, bound by the gravity of truth. I saw heads lower, pride bent into silence, shame rising where arrogance once stood. My grandson sat frozen, his head bowed, his face pale. He had mocked the very cloth that now demanded reverence without a word, and there was no escape for him in that aisle, no corner dark enough to hide his shame. I did not walk quickly, nor did I bow beneath the weight of their stares. I walked with the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. The chandeliers poured light upon me, as if they had waited all evening for this procession, as if they understood that justice sometimes arrives not in thunder, but in steps, slow, steady, undeniable. When I reached the front, the hall no longer saw an old man in a wrinkled suit. They saw what had always been there, but what they had refused to acknowledge. Sacrifice clothed in dignity, a legacy stitched into every thread. And in that silence, in that reverence, I felt the truth settle at last. Mockery had been burned away, whispers silenced, and respect restored. I stood before them, the hall still heavy with applause, and when the sound finally ebbed into silence, I let the weight of that quiet rest on my shoulders. I did not raise my hands for attention. I did not bask in their sudden reverence. I only looked out at the faces that had turned toward me, faces that hours earlier had passed me by as if I were invisible. And then, in a voice not loud but steady, I spoke. This event stands because I believed in it. Nothing more. No list of sacrifices, no tally of sums given, no attempt to bend their admiration into worship. Just the truth, plain and unadorned. The words seemed to ripple through the air, not because they were grand, but because they carried a weight that money could not measure. I did not speak of checks written or figures transferred. I spoke of faith, the faith to build when others doubted, the faith to invest not in stone and glass, but in people, in community, in the belief that something good could last beyond us. I spoke of legacy, not as inheritance of wealth, but as the quiet work of ensuring that those who came after would stand taller than we did. As the words left me, I saw the change ripple across the hall. Heads bowed slightly, not in applause this time, but in understanding. Some faces softened, others darkened with shame. The truth has a way of undoing arrogance, because no amount of pride can erase the sight of a man standing with nothing to prove, offering only the weight of what he has lived. My grandson sat among them, still, his shoulders stiff, his eyes downcast. I did not look at him directly, but I felt his silence, the silence of a boy who had mocked a suit, and now sat beneath the shadow of the legacy it carried. I ended my words there. I did not fill the silence with explanations, did not stretch my dignity into speeches. I let the truth stand alone, because truth never needs decoration. And in that moment, the hall did not see an old man boasting of what he had done. They saw what they could no longer deny, a life of sacrifice woven into the very foundation beneath their feet. My words had ended, but the silence they left behind weighed more heavily than thunder. I did not need to look at my grandson to know where he sat, still, small, suddenly stripped of the careless pride that had carried him all night. His head was bowed, his eyes fixed on the polished floor, as though it alone could shield him from the truth hanging in the air. His cheeks glowed red, the flush not of youth but of shame, and in that color I saw the collapse of everything he had built with his laughter. Moments earlier he had mocked me, made sport of the suit that wrapped around my shoulders, dismissed me as a relic unworthy of the evening. Now he sat in chains, not the kind forged of iron, but of conscience. The echo of his laughter, which had once seemed so light, so triumphant, now returned to him like a haunting refrain, wrapping around his neck, pressing against his chest until he could hardly lift his head. He had mocked the very man who had built the stage beneath his feet, who had carried burdens he would never understand, who had given so that he could take, who had endured so that he could live without knowing the weight of endurance. The hall still shimmered with reverence, but for him the light was different. The chandeliers above, the applause that still trembled in the air, no longer celebrated him as part of the confident future. No, They revealed him, exposed him as a boy who had forgotten his roots, who had betrayed blood with arrogance. Every pair of eyes that had once laughed with him now avoided him, their silence cutting deeper than ridicule ever could. He was not mocked now. He was seen, and that sight was unbearable. I watched without speaking, without gloating, without lifting my hand to punish. Justice was already there, alive in his burning cheeks, in the weight pulling his head toward the floor. He sat imprisoned in a lesson harsher than any words I could have spoken. The knowledge that respect cannot be bought with youth, and dignity cannot be measured by fashion. It is built, it is carried, it is lived. And in that hall, with every breath, I embodied what he had tried to erase. He could not undo his laughter. He could not pull back the whispers he had released into the air. They were his now, branded onto his memory, forever tied to this moment when he discovered the cost of arrogance. And as he lowered his gaze deeper, his shame became the justice I never asked for, but always deserved. I looked across the hall, the sea of faces still fixed on me, waiting for more words, for rebuke, for some sharp lesson to be hurled into the air. But none came. My lips did not curve with anger. My eyes did not narrow with scorn. I stood calm, steady, rooted in the silence that followed. Justice had already arrived, and it had no need of fury. It was not the kind that thundered, nor the kind that demanded vengeance. It was the quiet, undeniable truth that had revealed itself for all to see, the truth that dignity cannot be erased by mockery, that respect does not die in shadows, that sacrifice never fades, even when forgotten. My grandson's head hung low, his shame heavy enough to bend his young shoulders. I did not point him out, did not speak his name, did not humiliate him as he had humiliated me. I did not need to. His guilt sat with him more firmly than chains ever could, and in the stillness of my restraint he felt it sharper than if I had shouted. He had wanted me erased, yet here I was, standing taller than the stage itself, honored not by boast but by truth. The hall bore witness to the balance restored, and it was a lesson they would carry longer than any sermon. I glanced once toward the family who had passed me by without pause earlier that evening. They shifted uncomfortably now, caught in the revelation that the man they had tolerated, the one they had let sit in shadows, was the very reason the light burned above their heads. None of them could meet my gaze, and that silence, that shame, was justice enough. The chandeliers glowed brighter. The music faltered as if it too bowed in recognition, and I felt no desire to demand more than what had already been given. Fury might have made them fear me, but truth made them see me, and in that sight my dignity returned to its rightful place, not because they gave it back, but because it had never left. They had tried to bury it under laughter, but dignity, like stone, cannot be broken by whispers. I stood there, without vengeance, without pride. I was not a victor, nor a beggar seeking redemption. I was simply a man who had endured, and whose endurance had outlasted betrayal. Justice had arrived not in the clamor of punishment, but in the stillness of truth, and in that stillness they finally understood. When the night finally drew to a close, the music softened, the applause faded, and the crowd began to scatter into the corridors of their own comfortable lives. But I remained still for a moment longer, my hands resting against the same suit I had worn when I entered, the suit that had been mocked, dismissed, whispered about in cruel laughter. It had not changed. It carried the same creases, the same folds, the same humble cut. Yet something irreversible had shifted. To the eyes that had ridiculed it, it was no longer old. It was no longer a costume from another era. It had become a garment bound to a story they could never erase. They looked at me differently now, the way one looks at a monument rather than a man. The same fabric that had drawn their smirks now demanded reverence, for it had carried not only my body, but also my years, my sacrifices, my unwavering belief in the worth of quiet endurance. Every thread seemed to hold a memory. The nights I had stayed awake working when sleep would have been easier, the days I had gone without comfort so that others could eat, the decades of labor that had built not only buildings but lives. They had once seen nothing but wrinkles. Now they saw history stitched into the seams, dignity pressed into the folds, sacrifice woven through every stitch. My grandson lingered near the back, his face pale, his lips tight, his eyes refusing to rise to mine. He did not laugh again. He could not. The sound that had once come so easily to him was gone, swallowed by the weight of the truth he had witnessed. I had not scolded him, had not called his name, had not raised my voice against him, but he carried the sentence all the same. His shame would last longer than any punishment I could have given, for now he knew what he had mocked was not just fabric, not just an outdated garment, it was legacy itself. He had laughed at the suit of a man who had carried generations on his back, and that laughter would echo in him as a chain he could never cast off. The hall grew emptier, yet the silence it left behind was not emptiness. It was a silence filled with memory, with realization, with the permanence of what they had seen. They would forget the speeches, the names in the booklet, the fleeting applause for donors who gave only from excess. But they would not forget the old man in the wrinkled suit, the one they had overlooked until truth forced their eyes open. My name had been spoken, my presence acknowledged, and my dignity restored, not by their permission, but by the undeniable weight of a life lived in sacrifice. When I stepped back into the night air, the cool wind brushed against my face, and the suit around me seemed to settle like a second skin. It had carried me through humiliation, through indifference, through betrayal, and at last through justice. It was still the same suit, but now it bore a crown invisible to the world, yet unforgettable to every soul who had seen it tonight. To them, it was no longer fabric, it was testimony. And as I walked away, I knew one thing with certainty. My grandson would never laugh at it again. He could not, because now the suit had become history, stitched with dignity, unerasable. It would outlive the smirk that had once belittled it. It would outlive the whispers that had tried to bury it. It had become what all true legacies become: silent, enduring, undeniable.